Tonight, we journey back through deep time to an era when Earth's climate hung in a delicate balance, and when the very first forests began to reshape our planet in ways that would echo through hundreds of millions of years. This is the story of how trees, in their quiet conquest of the land, nearly brought about a climate catastrophe that would dwarf anything in recorded history. Picture, if you will, a world from over 400 million years ago. The continents were arranged differently then, clustered together in ways that would seem alien to our modern eyes. The air was thick and humid, carrying more carbon dioxide than our atmosphere holds today. Oceans covered most of the planet's surface, while the land remained largely barren, painted in shades of red rock and volcanic ash. Life had only recently begun its tentative steps onto dry ground, and the very concept of a forest existed nowhere on Earth. In this ancient world, plants were small, humble things. They hugged the ground like living carpets, never reaching more than a few inches in height. Mosses and primitive ferns spread slowly across the rocky landscape, drawing their moisture directly from the air around them. These early colonizers had no roots to speak of, no woody stems to lift them toward the sun, and no grand ambitions beyond surviving in this harsh new environment. But change was coming, though it would unfold with the patient slowness that defines all great transformations in Earth's history. Deep within the cells of these simple plants, evolutionary pressures were building towards something unprecedented. The competition for sunlight would soon drive life to reach upward in ways that had never been attempted before. The Devonian period, beginning around 419 million years ago, marked the dawn of what we might call the Age of Trees. Though these early giants bore little resemblance to the oaks and pines we know today, they represented a revolutionary leap in the complexity of life on land. The first true trees began as experiments in vertical growth, primitive attempts to capture more sunlight by rising above their competitors. These pioneering trees developed something that would prove far more consequential than anyone could have imagined at the time. They grew roots, not the simple anchoring structures that earlier plants had used, but complex branching networks that could penetrate deep into solid rock. These root systems spread horizontally through the soil and pushed vertically downward, sometimes extending dozens of feet below the surface. What made these roots truly revolutionary was their ability to secrete acids. As they grew through cracks in the bedrock, they released organic compounds that could dissolve even the hardest minerals. This process, known as chemical weathering, had existed before in small scales, but never with the intensity and persistence that these new root systems would bring to bear on the landscape. The trees of the Devonian were strange creatures by modern standards. Archaeopteris, one of the first true forest trees, could reach heights of nearly 100 feet, its trunk supported by a woody structure that was still experimental in design. Its leaves were delicate, fern-like fronds that caught the humid air, while its roots spread in all directions, seeking nutrients and water from the rocky substrate below. As these early forests spread across the available land, they began to transform the very surface of the planet. Wherever trees took root, they accelerated the breakdown of rock at rates that Earth had never experienced before. The acids secreted by their roots worked constantly, dissolving feldspar, granite, and basalt, releasing minerals into the groundwater and creating the first true soils in Earth's history. This process of enhanced weathering had consequences that rippled far beyond the forest floor. When rocks weather chemically, they consume carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The CO2 dissolved in rainwater forms weak carbonic acid, which reacts with minerals in the rock to form bicarbonate ions. These ions eventually make their way to the oceans, where they contribute to the formation of limestone and other carbonate rocks, effectively removing carbon from the atmospheric cycle. Before the Age of Trees, this weathering process had proceeded at a relatively modest pace. But now, with millions of trees actively accelerating the breakdown of rock across entire continents, the rate of CO2 removal from the atmosphere began to increase dramatically. Each tree through its network of acid-secreting roots, became an unwitting participant in a planetary-scale chemical reaction. The forests continued to expand as the Devonian period progressed. What had begun as scattered groves along riverbanks and coastal plains gradually merged into continuous woodlands that stretched across vast regions of the supercontinent. The trees themselves grew larger and more sophisticated, developing more efficient root systems and more extensive canopies. As the Carboniferous period began around 359 million years ago, the transformation of Earth's landscape reached unprecedented scales. The warm, humid climate of the time created perfect conditions for plant growth, and forests spread across nearly every available piece of land. These were not the diverse woodlands we might imagine today, but rather vast monocultures dominated by a few species of giant lycopsids and early conifers. The most remarkable of these ancient trees were the lycopsids, enormous relatives of modern club mosses that could reach heights of over 150 feet. Lepidodendron and Sigillaria created forests of towering, scale-barked giants that looked more like enormous asparagus spears than traditional trees. Their trunks were hollow and supported not by solid wood, but by thick layers of bark and cortical tissue. Despite their unusual anatomy, these giants proved remarkably successful at capturing sunlight and spreading across the landscape. These Carboniferous forests differed from modern woodlands in another crucial way. When trees died and fell, they did not decay quickly back into the atmosphere. The warm, waterlogged conditions of the coal swamps created an environment where dead plant matter accumulated faster than it could decompose. Fallen trees piled up in thick layers, becoming buried under sediment and gradually transforming into peat and eventually into coal. This process of carbon burial represented something entirely new in Earth's history. Previously, when plants died, most of their carbon content would return to the atmosphere through decay. But now, vast quantities of carbon were being locked away underground, removed from the atmospheric cycle for millions of years. The forests were not just consuming CO2 through enhanced weathering, they were also physically burying enormous amounts of carbon in the form of dead plant matter. The scale of this carbon sequestration was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that Carboniferous forests removed carbon from the atmosphere at rates dozens of times higher than any natural process operating today. In some regions, the equivalent of several tons of carbon per acre was being buried every year, creating the thick coal seams that would eventually power human civilization. As this process continued over millions of years, the composition of Earth's atmosphere began to shift in ways that would have profound consequences for the planet's climate. Carbon dioxide levels, which had been elevated throughout much of the early Paleozoic era, began to drop steadily. At the same time, the increased plant photosynthesis was pumping more oxygen into the atmosphere than ever before. The combination of falling CO2 and rising oxygen created atmospheric conditions unlike anything Earth had experienced before or since. Oxygen levels climbed from around 20% to nearly 35% of the atmosphere, while carbon dioxide plummeted from over 2,000 parts per million to levels that would eventually reach as low as 150 parts per million. These changing atmospheric conditions had immediate effects on the planet's climate system. Carbon dioxide acts as a greenhouse gas, trapping heat in the atmosphere and warming the planet's surface. As CO2 levels dropped, Earth began to cool. The cooling was gradual at first, but as the forests continued their relentless consumption of the atmospheric carbon, the effects became more pronounced. The cooling climate had cascading effects throughout the Earth system. As temperatures dropped, more water began to freeze at the poles, forming ice caps that reflected sunlight back into space and cooling the planet further. This positive feedback loop amplified the cooling effect, driving temperatures even lower. Ocean currents shifted as the temperature differential between the poles and equator changed. Weather patterns became more variable and extreme. The warm, stable climate that had allowed the great forest to flourish in the first place began to give way to a more chaotic and unpredictable system. By the late Carboniferous period, around 300 million years ago, Earth had entered one of the most severe ice ages in its entire history. Massive ice sheets spread across the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, covering areas that today include South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet as water became locked up in continental glaciers. The forests that had inadvertently triggered this climate crisis found themselves under increasing pressure as conditions became cooler and more arid. The warm, humid coal swamps that had supported the giant lycopsids began to dry up. Seasonal variations in temperature and precipitation, previously unknown in many regions, became the new normal. The very trees that had so successfully colonized the land now faced an environment that was increasingly hostile to their survival. Their massive carbon sequestration had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to their own decline, though this process would unfold over millions of years rather than the brief spans of time that characterize modern environmental changes. As we pause in our journey through deep time, we find ourselves witnessing one of the most remarkable examples of unintended consequences in Earth's history. The forests of the Devonian and Carboniferous periods had achieved something unprecedented in the history of life on our planet. Through their simple acts of growing, spreading, and dying, they had fundamentally altered the chemistry of the atmosphere and triggered a global climate transformation that would reshape the face of the Earth. The atmospheric transformation that followed would create conditions so extreme that life on Earth would be forced to adapt or perish, as carbon dioxide levels continued their relentless decline, dropping from concentrations that had sustained warm, humid climates for millions of years to levels that would barely support plant photosynthesis. The planet entered what geologists now recognize as one of the most severe and prolonged ice ages in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. The late Paleozoic Ice Age, as scientists call this period, stretched across more than 100 million years, from the late Devonian through the end of the Permian period. Unlike the relatively brief glacial periods that would characterize more recent Earth history, this ice age represented a fundamental shift in the planet's climate system, driven not by orbital variations or volcanic activity, but by the biological processes of the forests themselves. Evidence for this dramatic cooling comes from rocks scattered across what were once the southern continents. In places that are now Brazil, South Africa, India, and Australia, geologists have found the telltale signs of ancient glaciation. Massive boulders, dropped by melting ice sheets, lie embedded in fine sediments thousands of miles from their origins. Scratches and grooves carved into bedrock by moving glaciers record the directions of ice flow across landscapes that had never before experienced such cold. The ice sheets that formed during this period were unlike anything in Earth's more recent history. They covered an area larger than Antarctica today, stretching across most of the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. In some regions, ice accumulated to thicknesses of several miles, its immense weight pressing down on the continental crust and causing it to sink into the underlying mantle. As more and more water became locked up in these continental ice sheets, sea levels dropped by as much as 400 feet below their previous highs. Shallow seas that had covered vast areas of the continents drained away, exposing new land surfaces to erosion and weathering. Coastlines shifted hundreds of miles seaward, fundamentally altering the geography of the planet. The cooling climate also transformed the atmospheric conditions that had made the great forests possible in the first place. The warm, stable weather patterns that had characterized the early Carboniferous gave way to more seasonal and variable conditions. Temperatures began to fluctuate more dramatically between summer and winter, and between day and night. Precipitation patterns became irregular, with some regions experiencing severe droughts, while others faced devastating floods. These changing conditions placed enormous stress on the forest ecosystems that had inadvertently triggered the climate crisis. The giant lycopsids, which had evolved in warm, consistently humid environments, found themselves struggling to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly cold and dry. Their shallow root systems, perfectly adapted to the waterlogged soils of tropical swamps, could not cope with the seasonal droughts that were becoming more common. The atmospheric changes also affected the fundamental chemistry of plant growth. As carbon dioxide levels dropped toward the minimum needed for photosynthesis, plants had to work harder to extract the CO2 they needed from the increasingly thin atmospheric concentrations. Some species adapted by developing more efficient photosynthetic pathways, while others simply could not keep up with the changing conditions. Meanwhile, the rising oxygen levels created their own set of challenges and opportunities. Oxygen concentrations climbed to 35% of the atmosphere, nearly twice the levels we experience today. This oxygen-rich environment had profound effects on both plant and animal life, though not always in ways that might be expected. For plants, the high oxygen concentrations made fires more likely and more intense. Lightning strikes or volcanic activity could ignite forest fires that burned with unprecedented ferocity, consuming vast areas of woodland in conflagrations that could last for months. The charcoal remains of these ancient fires can still be found in carboniferous rock layers, testimony to the destructive power of fire in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. But the high oxygen levels also enabled the evolution of some of the most remarkable creatures in Earth's history. Arthropods, the group that includes insects, spiders, and crustaceans, experienced an unprecedented explosion in size. Without the complex respiratory systems of vertebrates, arthropods rely on simple diffusion to transport oxygen through their bodies. In the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Carboniferous, this diffusion process became so efficient that arthropods could grow to sizes that would be impossible in today's atmosphere. Giant dragonflies with wingspans approaching 3 feet patrolled the skies above the coal swamps. Millipedes grew to the length of automobiles, their segmented bodies armored with thick plates of chitin. Scorpions reached lengths of over 3 feet, their massive claws and venomous stings making them apex predators in their terrestrial ecosystems. These creatures inhabited a world that was simultaneously familiar and alien, sharing basic anatomical features with modern arthropods, while existing at scales that seem almost mythological today. The vertebrates of this period also adapted to the changing conditions, though in different ways. Early amphibians, which had first ventured onto land during the Devonian, diversified into a remarkable array of forms during the Carboniferous. Some remained small and lizard-like, while others grew to massive proportions, becoming the first large terrestrial predators. These early amphibians still depended on water for reproduction, laying their eggs in the ponds and streams that dotted the coal swamp landscapes. The first reptiles also appeared during this period, their waterproof eggs giving them a crucial advantage in the increasingly variable climate. Unlike amphibians, reptiles could reproduce entirely on land, freeing them from dependence on permanent water sources. This adaptation would prove crucial as the climate continued to cool, and many of the permanent wetlands began to dry up. As the Carboniferous period progressed, the stress on forest ecosystems became increasingly apparent. The coal swamps that had dominated the landscape for millions of years began to fragment into isolated patches, separated by areas of drier, more seasonal habitat. The giant lycopsids, unable to adapt quickly enough to the changing conditions, began to decline in both diversity and abundance. This decline was not uniform across all regions. In some areas, favourable local conditions allowed coal swamp ecosystems to persist for millions of years after they had disappeared elsewhere. River valleys and coastal lowlands provided refugia where the old forest communities could survive, at least temporarily, as the global climate continued to deteriorate. The process of coal formation itself began to change as the forests declined. The thick, continuous coal seams that characterized the Middle Carboniferous gave way to thinner, more sporadic deposits. The chemistry of the coals also shifted, reflecting changes in the types of plants that were being preserved and the conditions under which they were buried. By the late Carboniferous, around 300 million years ago, The great coal forests were in serious decline across much of their former range. The giant lycopsids that had once dominated these ecosystems were reduced to a few struggling species, clinging to survival in the remaining wetland refugia. Their place was being taken by new types of plants better adapted to the cooler, more seasonal conditions. Seed plants, including early conifers and their relatives, began to expand into habitats that had previously been dominated by spore-bearing lycopsids and ferns. These new plants had several advantages in the changing climate. Their seeds could survive dry periods that would kill the delicate spores of lycopsids. Their more efficient root systems could extract water from drier soils. Their waxy leaves could conserve water during periods of drought. The transition from lycopsid-dominated to seed plant-dominated ecosystems marked a fundamental turning point in the history of terrestrial life. The forests that emerged from this transition were more similar to modern woodlands, dominated by trees with solid wood and deep root systems, rather than the hollow-stemmed giants that had characterized the coal swamps. This ecological transition also marked the beginning of the end for the extreme carbon sequestration that had driven the climate crisis. The new forest ecosystems, while still removing carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and weathering, did so at much lower rates than their predecessors. The thick accumulations of undecomposed plant matter that had characterized the coal swamps became increasingly rare as decomposer organisms adapted to break down the new types of plant debris. The climate system began to show the first signs of stabilization, though full recovery would take millions of years. Carbon dioxide levels stopped their precipitous decline and began to fluctuate around lower but more stable concentrations. The massive ice sheets that had covered Gondwana began to wax and wane in response to orbital cycles, creating alternating periods of glaciation and relative warmth. Ocean chemistry also began to stabilize as the rate of carbon burial in terrestrial environments slowed. The massive transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to underground coal deposits had altered the ocean's carbonate chemistry, making seawater more alkaline and changing the conditions under which marine organisms could build their shells and skeletons. As carbon burial rates decreased, ocean chemistry gradually returned toward more normal values. The recovery was not uniform or immediate. Throughout the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods, the climate system continued to experience dramatic fluctuations. Ice ages came and went, with a frequency and intensity that would have made life difficult for any organisms adapted to stable conditions. Carbon dioxide levels swung wildly between near-starvation concentrations of less than 200 parts per million and more comfortable levels of several hundred parts per million. These fluctuations created what paleontologists recognize as one of the most challenging periods in the history of life on Earth. Ecosystems that had adapted to one set of conditions would suddenly find themselves facing dramatically different circumstances as the climate swung between glacial and interglacial states. Species that had survived for millions of years in stable environments were forced to adapt quickly or face extinction. The marine realm experienced its own set of challenges as sea levels rose and fell with the growth and melting of ice sheets. Shallow water habitats, which had been home to diverse communities of corals, brachiopods, and other marine organisms, were repeatedly exposed and submerged as the climate oscillated between warm and cold phases. Many groups of marine organisms that had flourished in the stable conditions of the Middle Carboniferous found themselves unable to cope with these rapid changes. The terrestrial vertebrates also faced unprecedented challenges as their habitats shifted and changed. Amphibians, still dependent on aquatic environments for reproduction, were particularly vulnerable as wetlands dried up during glacial periods and reformed during interglacials. Many lineages of large amphibians that had dominated Carboniferous ecosystems disappeared during this period, replaced by smaller, more adaptable forms. Reptiles, with their independence from water for reproduction, proved more resilient to the changing conditions. Early reptile groups began to diversify rapidly during the late Carboniferous and early Permian, taking advantage of the ecological opportunities created by the decline of amphibian competitors. Some evolved into large herbivores that could feed on the changing vegetation, while others became specialized predators adapted to hunt in the new terrestrial ecosystems. The plant communities that emerged from this period of climate instability were fundamentally different from those that had preceded them. Gone were the vast monocultures of giant lycopsids that had characterized the coal swamps. In their place arose more diverse forest communities dominated by seed plants, including early conifers, seed ferns, and other groups that would eventually give rise to modern plant families. These new plant communities were better adapted to variable climate conditions. Their deeper root systems could access water during dry periods. Their more efficient vascular systems could transport water and nutrients more effectively. Their seeds provided a means of surviving unfavorable conditions that spore-bearing plants lacked. Most importantly, they were less effective at sequestering carbon on the massive scales that had characterized their predecessors. Ors. The transformation of Earth's plant communities during this period of climate upheaval represented more than just a change in species composition. It marked the emergence of ecological relationships and evolutionary strategies that would define terrestrial life for hundreds of millions of years to come. The forests that replaced the coal swamps were not merely different in their botanical makeup, but operated according to entirely new principles of energy flow, nutrient cycling, and environmental response. These emerging forest ecosystems developed what we might recognize as the first truly modern approach to carbon cycling. Unlike the lycopsid-dominated swamps, where vast quantities of organic matter accumulated in waterlogged sediments, the new forests established more balanced relationships between carbon fixation and carbon release. Dead plant material decomposed more readily in the better-drained soils that characterized the post-swamp landscapes, returning nutrients to the soil and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in a more regular cycle. The development of these more efficient decomposition processes was aided by the evolution of new groups of fungi and bacteria that could break down the complex organic molecules found in seed plant tissues. These decomposer organisms had struggled to process the unusual biochemistry of lycopside remains, but they proved much more effective at recycling the cellulose and lignin that made up the structural tissues of the new dominant plants. This shift in decomposition efficiency had profound implications for soil development across the planet. The coal swamp environments had produced soils that were rich in organic matter but poor in mineral nutrients, as the waterlogged conditions prevented the normal processes of soil formation from operating effectively. The new forest ecosystems, growing on better-drained substrates, began to develop the first truly mature soil profiles in Earth's history. These developing soils represented a new form of biological-geological interaction that had never existed before. Plant roots, fungal networks, bacterial communities, and invertebrate soil fauna worked together to create complex, layered soil profiles with distinct horizons of organic matter accumulation, mineral weathering, and nutrient transport. The top layers became rich in decomposing plant material and the organisms that processed it, while deeper layers showed the chemical effects of root activity and water movement through the soil profile. The formation of these mature soils created new opportunities for plant diversity and specialization. Different species could now occupy distinct ecological niches based on their soil preferences, root architecture, and nutrient requirements. Some plants specialized in growing on the nutrient-rich surface layers, while others developed deep root systems that could access minerals from the weathered bedrock below. This vertical stratification of the soil environment supported a corresponding diversification of plant communities above ground. Forest canopy structure also became more complex during this period of transition. The coal swamps had been dominated by a relatively small number of very tall species, creating forests with simple vertical structure and limited habitat diversity. The new seed plant forests developed multiple canopy layers, with tall emergent trees forming the upper canopy, smaller understory trees filling intermediate levels, and shrubs and herbaceous plants occupying the forest floor. This increased structural complexity provided habitat for a much greater diversity of animal life. Insects evolved to specialize in different parts of the forest environment, with some species adapted to life in the high canopy, others specializing in understory conditions, and still others making their homes in the leaf litter and soil. The three-dimensional complexity of the forest ecosystem supported food webs of unprecedented complexity and stability. The vertebrate communities that inhabited these evolving forests also showed increasing diversity and specialization. Early reptiles began to diverge into distinct lineages adapted to different aspects of forest life. Some became specialized herbivores, developing the first efficient mechanisms for digesting plant material and extracting nutrients from leaves, stems, and seeds. Others evolved as predators, taking advantage of the growing diversity of prey species in the forest ecosystems. The amphibians that survived the transition period also adapted to the new forest conditions, though their continued dependence on water for reproduction limited their ecological options compared to the more versatile reptiles. Many amphibian lineages became smaller and more specialized, occupying particular microhabitats within the forest where they could find the moisture and food resources they needed to survive. As these more complex forest ecosystems became established across the landscape, their effects on global climate began to stabilize around new equilibrium points. The extreme carbon sequestration rates that had characterized the coal swamp period gradually moderated as decomposition processes became more efficient and carbon cycling more balanced. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere stopped their precipitous decline and began to fluctuate around concentrations that, while still lower than pre-forest levels, were high enough to support robust plant growth. The stabilization of atmospheric carbon dioxide had cascading effects throughout the Earth system. Ocean chemistry began to return to more normal values as the rate of carbon burial in terrestrial environments decreased. The extreme alkalinity that had characterized seawater during the peak of coal formation gradually gave way to more typical conditions, allowing marine organisms to rebuild their populations and diversify into new ecological roles. Temperature patterns across the planet also began to show signs of stabilization, though the massive ice sheets that had formed on Gondwana continued to influence global climate for millions of years. The extreme cooling that had characterized the peak of the Ice Age began to moderate as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels stabilized, though temperatures remained significantly cooler than they had been during the early Carboniferous period. The ocean circulation patterns that had been disrupted by the formation of massive ice sheets gradually adjusted to the new climatic conditions. Deep water formation in polar regions continued to drive global circulation patterns, but the extreme temperature differences between ice-covered and ice-free regions began to moderate as the climate system found new points of balance. Sea level fluctuations, which had been extreme during the height of the Ice Age, also began to moderate as the rate of ice sheet growth and decay slowed. While glacial-interglacial cycles continued to drive significant changes in sea level, the amplitude of these fluctuations decreased as the climate system became less sensitive to small changes in atmospheric composition or orbital forcing. The marine ecosystems that had been severely disrupted by the extreme sea level changes of the late Carboniferous began to recover and diversify. Shallow water habitats, which had been repeatedly exposed and submerged as ice sheets grew and melted, provided opportunities for evolutionary innovation as marine organisms adapted to the variable conditions. Coral reefs, which had been virtually eliminated during the most severe phases of the Ice Age, began to re-establish themselves in tropical shallow waters. These new reef communities were different from their Carboniferous predecessors, built by different groups of organisms and adapted to the changed ocean chemistry and temperature conditions that characterized the post-Ice Age world. The recovery of marine ecosystems had important implications for global carbon cycling, as healthy ocean communities played crucial roles in processing atmospheric carbon dioxide. Marine photosynthesis by phytoplankton and other organisms helped to balance terrestrial carbon fixation, while the formation of carbonate shells and skeletons by marine animals provided another pathway for removing carbon from the ocean atmosphere system. On land, the stabilizing climate allowed forest ecosystems to expand into regions that had been too cold or dry to support tree growth during the height of the Ice Age. The seed plants that had evolved during the climate crisis proved well adapted to colonizing these newly available habitats, spreading across vast areas of previously barren landscape. These expanding forests developed regional characteristics based on local climate and soil conditions. In areas that remained relatively cool and moist, conifer-dominated forests became established, their needle-like leaves and waxy coatings well adapted to conserve water and resist freezing. In warmer regions, more diverse forest communities developed, including early representatives of groups that would eventually give rise to flowering plants. The expansion of forest cover had positive feedback effects on regional climate stability. Forest canopies moderated local temperature extremes, reducing the intensity of both summer heat and winter cold. Tree roots helped to stabilize soil and reduce erosion, maintaining the landscape stability that supported diverse plant and animal communities. The water cycle became more regular as forests intercepted rainfall, reduced surface runoff, and released moisture back to the atmosphere through transpiration. These regional climate modifications helped to buffer the remaining global climate fluctuations, making conditions more predictable and stable for the organisms that inhabited forest ecosystems. The extreme climate variability that had characterized the late Carboniferous gradually gave way to more moderate oscillations that ecosystems could accommodate without experiencing massive disruption. The vertebrate communities that inhabited these stabilizing forest ecosystems continued to diversify and specialize. Reptile groups that had originated during the climate crisis began to explore new ecological roles, including some that would eventually lead to the evolution of mammals and birds. Early synapsids, the group that would eventually give rise to mammals, began to develop more efficient metabolism and more sophisticated temperature regulation. Plant-eating vertebrates became larger and more diverse as forest productivity increased and plant communities became more nutritionally varied. Some early herbivores developed specialized digestive systems that could process tough plant materials, while others focused on softer, more easily digested plant parts like seeds and young leaves. The predators that fed on these herbivores also became more diverse and sophisticated. Some evolved as ambush predators that could hide in the complex forest vegetation, while others became pursuit predators that could chase prey through open areas between forest patches. The arms race between predators and prey drove evolutionary innovations in both sensory systems and locomotory abilities. Insect communities reached new levels of diversity and ecological importance during this period of forest expansion and stabilization. The high oxygen levels that had characterized the Carboniferous continued into the early Permian, supporting populations of giant arthropods that served as both predators and prey in forest food webs. Flying insects became particularly diverse, taking advantage of the three-dimensional habitat provided by forest canopies. The relationship between insects and plants became increasingly sophisticated during this period. Some insects evolved specialized feeding relationships with particular plant species, while plants developed new chemical and physical defenses against insect attack. These co-evolutionary interactions drove innovations in both plant secondary chemistry and insect detoxification mechanisms. Pollination relationships between insects and plants also became more specialized during this period, though the evolution of flowers was still far in the future. Some seed plants developed structures that attracted insects for spore or pollen dispersal, creating the first steps toward the complex pollination systems that would characterize later plant communities. The forest floor communities that developed in these stabilizing ecosystems were particularly rich and complex. Decomposer organisms, including fungi, bacteria, and invertebrate detritivores, formed intricate networks that processed dead plant and animal material and recycled nutrients back into the soil. These decomposer communities were essential for maintaining forest productivity and supporting the complex food webs that characterized mature forest ecosystems. Soil invertebrates, including early representatives of groups like millipedes, centipedes, and various types of worms, became increasingly important in soil formation and nutrient cycling. These organisms physically broke down dead plant material, mixed organic matter with mineral soil particles, and created the complex soil structure that supported diverse plant communities. The mycorrhizal associations between plant roots and soil fungi also became more sophisticated and widespread during this period. These partnerships, in which fungi helped plants access nutrients from the soil in exchange for carbohydrates from photosynthesis, improved plant nutrition and allowed forests to grow in soils that would otherwise have been too nutrient poor to support tree growth. As the Permian period progressed, the forest ecosystems that had emerged from the climate crisis of the late Carboniferous continued to evolve and mature. The extreme conditions that had characterized the transition period gave way to more stable environments that could support increasingly complex ecological relationships. The lessons learned during the crisis period had prepared terrestrial life for the challenges that lay ahead, including the even more severe environmental disruptions that would characterize the end of the Permian period. The legacy of the Great Climate Crisis triggered by the first forests extended far beyond the immediate effects on Carboniferous ecosystems. The coal deposits that formed from the accumulated plant material of that period would eventually become one of the most important energy sources for human civilization. While the atmospheric and climatic changes initiated by those ancient forests established patterns of Earth system behavior that would influence the planet's environmental history for hundreds of millions of years to come, the carbon that had been sequestered so effectively by the coal swamp forests remained locked in underground deposits, removed from active participation in the carbon cycle until human activities began to release it back to the atmosphere. The irony that the same carbon sequestration process that had once cooled the planet to near catastrophic levels would eventually contribute to modern global warming represents one of the most striking examples of how Earth's environmental history continues to influence contemporary climate change. Looking back across the vast sweep of geological time, we can trace the profound changes that these transforming ecosystems brought to Earth's fundamental life processes. The forests that had emerged from the climate upheaval were not simply collections of individual trees, but rather integrated biological systems that operated according to principles entirely different from anything that had existed before on our planet. The photosynthetic capacity of these expanding forest communities represented a quantum leap in Earth's ability to capture and process solar energy. Unlike the simple plant communities that had preceded them, these complex forest ecosystems could intercept nearly all of the sunlight that reached the ground, channeling that energy through multiple layers of leaves and branches before it could reach the forest floor. The efficiency of this light capture meant that forests could support far more biomass per unit area than any previous terrestrial ecosystem. This increased biological productivity had cascading effects throughout the Earth system. The trees themselves became massive reservoirs of carbon, storing in their wood and bark quantities of atmospheric carbon that dwarfed anything that had existed in earlier ecosystems. A single large tree could contain as much carbon as an entire square mile of the primitive plant communities that had characterized the pre-forest world. The root systems of these trees continued to transform the underlying geology in ways that extended far beyond simple mechanical weathering. As root networks became more extensive and sophisticated, they began to create entirely new types of chemical environments in the soil. Different species developed root systems with distinct chemical signatures, secreting specific combinations of organic acids that could dissolve particular types of minerals. These specialized weathering processes began to sort and concentrate different elements in the soil profile, creating chemical gradients that had never existed before. Some minerals became concentrated near the surface, while others were leached downward into deeper soil layers. This chemical stratification of the soil environment created new ecological opportunities for plants with different mineral requirements. The mycorrhizal fungi that formed partnerships with tree roots also became increasingly diverse and specialized during this period. Different fungal species evolved to process different types of rock minerals, creating complex underground networks that could access nutrients from a wide variety of geological substrates. These fungal networks sometimes extended for miles underground, connecting individual trees into vast cooperative systems that could share resources across entire forest communities. The integration of these biological and geological processes created what we might recognize as the first truly stable terrestrial ecosystems in Earth's history. The coal swamps had been productive, but inherently unstable, dependent on very specific hydrological conditions that could change rapidly with shifts in climate or sea level. The new forest ecosystems proved much more resilient, able to persist through moderate changes in temperature and precipitation. This resilience came partly from the diversity of plant species that made up the forest communities. Unlike the monoculture-like coal swamps, the new forests contained dozens or even hundreds of different plant species, each adapted to slightly different environmental conditions. When climate fluctuations made conditions unfavorable for some species, others could expand to fill their ecological roles, maintaining forest cover and ecosystem function, even as the species composition shifted. The animal communities that inhabited these stable forest ecosystems also reached new levels of complexity and integration. Herbivorous insects evolved intricate relationships with specific plant species, sometimes becoming so specialized that they could feed on only a single type of leaf or seed. These specialized feeding relationships created complex webs of interaction that helped to regulate plant populations and maintain forest diversity. Vertebrate herbivores also became more diverse and ecologically important during this period. Some evolved as browsers that could feed on the leaves and twigs of understory plants, while others became specialized seed eaters that could crack open the tough, protective coats that many plants had evolved around their reproductive structures. Still others developed as bark feeders or root feeders, exploiting parts of plants that had previously been largely unused by animal consumers. The predators that fed on these herbivores became correspondingly diverse and sophisticated. Some evolved as specialized hunters of particular types of prey, while others became generalist predators that could switch between different food sources as availability changed. The complexity of these predator-prey relationships helped to stabilize animal populations and prevent any single species from becoming so abundant that it could damage the forest ecosystem. Flying insects reached unprecedented diversity during this period, taking advantage of the three-dimensional habitat created by forest canopies. Different insect species specialized in different parts of the forest environment, with some living exclusively in the high canopy, others in the understory, and still others in the leaf litter on the forest floor. This vertical stratification of insect communities paralleled the layered structure of the forest vegetation itself. The pollination relationships between insects and plants became increasingly sophisticated, even though true flowers had not yet evolved. Some plants developed colorful or fragrant structures that attracted insects, while the insects evolved sensory systems that could detect and respond to these plant signals. These early pollination relationships laid the groundwork for the much more complex plant-pollinator interactions that would characterize later terrestrial ecosystems. Decomposer communities in forest soils also reached new levels of complexity during this period. The leaf litter that accumulated on forest floors provided habitat for countless species of fungi, bacteria, and invertebrate decomposers. These organisms developed intricate relationships with each other, with some species specialized for breaking down fresh leaf litter, others for processing partially decomposed material, and still others for recycling the final products of decomposition back into forms that plants could use. The soil food webs that emerged from these decomposer communities were among the most complex biological systems that had ever existed on Earth. nutrients cycled through multiple trophic levels as bacteria were consumed by protozoa, which were in turn eaten by small invertebrates, which became food for larger soil animals. These complex recycling processes made forest soils far more fertile and productive than any previous terrestrial environment. Water cycling in forest ecosystems also became more sophisticated and effective during this period. Tree canopies intercepted rainfall and released it gradually to the soil below, reducing erosion and maintaining more stable soil moisture levels. The extensive root systems of trees helped to prevent soil compaction and maintained pathways for water infiltration into deeper soil layers. The transpiration of water from tree leaves created local humidity that moderated temperature extremes and supported the growth of epiphytic plants and other organisms that required consistently moist conditions. This biological regulation of local climate helped to buffer forest ecosystems against larger-scale climate fluctuations, contributing to their stability and resilience. Forest streams and rivers also developed distinct characteristics during this period. The shade provided by forest canopies kept water temperatures more stable, while the input of leaves and woody debris from the surrounding forest created complex aquatic habitats. These forested waterways supported diverse communities of aquatic insects, fish, and other organisms that had no equivalent in non-forested landscapes. The seasonal patterns that characterized forest ecosystems added another layer of temporal complexity to these already intricate ecological systems. Unlike the relatively constant conditions of tropical coal swamps, temperate and boreal forests experienced regular cycles of growth and dormancy that created predictable patterns of resource availability. Many forest organisms evolved life cycles that were synchronized with these seasonal rhythms. Deciduous trees, which shed their leaves each autumn, created massive pulses of organic matter input to forest soils. The decomposition of these leaf litter inputs supported bursts of microbial activity that made nutrients available to plants at precisely the time when they were beginning their spring growth. This tight coupling between plant growth cycles and nutrient availability made forest ecosystems much more efficient at retaining and recycling essential elements. Seed production in forest trees also followed seasonal and longer-term cycles that helped to regulate animal populations and maintain ecological balance. Many tree species evolved masting behavior, producing enormous quantities of seeds in some years and very few in others. This unpredictable seed production prevented seed-eating animals from building up populations large enough to consume all of the seeds, ensuring that some would survive to germinate and maintain forest regeneration. The evolution of more sophisticated seed dispersal mechanisms during this period also contributed to forest stability and expansion. Some plants evolved seeds with wings or other structures that allowed them to travel long distances on wind currents. Others developed fleshy fruits that attracted animals, which would carry the seeds to new locations before depositing them in their feces. Still others evolved seeds with hooks or sticky surfaces that could attach to animal fur and be transported to suitable germination sites. These diverse dispersal mechanisms allowed forest communities to colonize new habitats more effectively and to recover more quickly from local disturbances. When fires, storms, or other events created openings in the forest canopy, seeds from surrounding areas could quickly establish new populations and begin the process of forest regeneration. The fire ecology of forest ecosystems also became more sophisticated during this period, while the high oxygen levels of the Carboniferous made fires more frequent and intense. Many plant species evolved adaptations that allowed them to survive or even benefit from periodic burning. Some trees developed thick bark that could protect their living tissues from fire damage, while others evolved the ability to resprout from their roots after their above-ground parts had been burned. Some plant species even became dependent on fire for successful reproduction, evolving seeds that would only germinate after exposure to the heat or smoke of forest fires. These fire-adapted species helped to maintain forest diversity by preventing any single group of plants from completely dominating forest communities. The geographic expansion of forest ecosystems during the recovery from the late Carboniferous Ice Age also contributed to global environmental stability. As forests spread across previously barren landscapes, they helped to moderate local and regional climate conditions. The albedo, or reflectivity, of forested landscapes was lower than that of bare rock or sparse vegetation, which meant that forests absorbed more solar radiation and helped to warm local climates. This warming effect of forests helped to counteract some of the cooling effects of the continuing ice sheets, creating more moderate climate conditions in many regions. The expansion of forests also helped to stabilize precipitation patterns, as the water transpired by trees contributed to local humidity and rainfall. The biogeochemical cycles that operated in these expanding forest ecosystems also became more complex and better integrated. The carbon cycle, which had been severely disrupted during the period of massive coal formation, began to reach a new equilibrium as the rates of carbon fixation and carbon release came into better balance. The nitrogen cycle also became more sophisticated as diverse communities of nitrogen-fixing bacteria evolved relationships with different types of forest plants. Phosphorus cycling, which had been relatively simple in earlier ecosystems, became much more complex as the diverse root systems and mycorrhizal networks of forest communities developed new mechanisms for accessing and recycling this essential nutrient. The sulfur cycle also became more intricate as the diverse chemical environments created by different plant species led to the evolution of specialized sulfur processing microorganisms. The integration of these biogeochemical cycles with the physical processes of weathering, erosion, and soil formation created Earth's first truly mature terrestrial ecosystems. These forests represented a new level of biological organization that had never existed before, characterized by complex feedbacks between living organisms and their physical environment that helped to maintain stable conditions suitable for life. The evolutionary innovations that emerged from the climate crisis of the late Carboniferous would continue to influence terrestrial life for hundreds of millions of years. The seed plants that had evolved during this period would eventually give rise to all of the major groups of land plants that dominate modern ecosystems. The soil communities that had developed would provide the foundation for all subsequent terrestrial life. The vertebrate groups that had survived and adapted to the changing conditions would continue to diversify and eventually give rise to dinosaurs, mammals, and birds. The complex ecological relationships that had evolved in these early forest ecosystems would serve as templates for the even more intricate ecosystems that would develop in later geological periods. Perhaps most importantly, the climate crisis triggered by the first forests had demonstrated that life itself could become a geological force capable of altering planetary environments on a global scale. The recognition that biological processes could drive climate change would prove crucial for understanding not only the history of Earth's climate system, but also the potential impacts of human activities on global environmental conditions. The forests that had once nearly destroyed Earth's climate, through their unintentional but massive alteration of atmospheric composition, had ultimately created the stable environmental conditions that would allow complex life to flourish for hundreds of millions of years. Their legacy would be written not only in the coal deposits that preserved their remains, but in the very structure and function of all subsequent terrestrial ecosystems. As we trace the long arc of recovery from that ancient climate crisis, we find ourselves witnessing one of the most profound lessons in Earth's environmental history. The same biological processes that had driven the planet toward environmental catastrophe had also contained within them the seeds of recovery and renewal. The forests that emerged from the crisis were not simply replacements for what had been lost, but represented entirely new forms of biological organization that were better adapted to the changed world they inhabited. The story of how trees almost destroyed the climate stands as a testament to both the power and the resilience of life on Earth. It reminds us that environmental change, even when severe and disruptive, can ultimately lead to new forms of stability and complexity that were impossible under previous conditions. In the deep time perspective of geological history, crisis and recovery are not opposite forces, but rather complementary aspects of the same evolutionary process that has shaped our planet for billions of years. Planet for billions of years. The profound transformation that had reshaped terrestrial ecosystems during the recovery from the Great Climate Crisis would continue to unfold across millions of years. But the most dramatic phase of planetary disruption was gradually giving way to something resembling equilibrium. As the Permian period advanced, the atmospheric composition that had swung so violently during the height of the forest-driven cooling began to stabilize around new baseline conditions that would define Earth's environmental character for eons to come. The carbon dioxide concentrations that had plummeted from over 2,000 parts per million to dangerously low levels of barely 150 parts per million began to find a more sustainable middle ground. This stabilization occurred not through any sudden reversal, but through the slow establishment of more balanced carbon cycling processes that had been generations in the making. The extreme carbon burial rates that had characterized the coal swamp period gradually diminished as decomposer organisms became more efficient at breaking down plant material before it could accumulate in oxygen-poor sediments. Fungi, in particular, underwent remarkable evolutionary diversification during this period of environmental transition. New lineages emerged that possessed increasingly sophisticated enzymatic machinery, capable of dismantling the complex organic polymers that made up woody plant tissues. These fungal communities developed intricate partnerships with bacterial decomposers, creating microbial consortiums that could process even the most recalcitrant plant compounds and return their carbon to the atmospheric cycle. The efficiency of these decomposition processes meant that forests could continue to grow and sequester carbon through photosynthesis without causing the massive net removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide that had characterized earlier periods. Carbon still moved from the atmosphere into plant biomass, but it was returned to the air much more reliably through the respiration of decomposer organisms, creating a more circular and sustainable carbon economy. This rebalancing of the carbon cycle had immediate effects on atmospheric chemistry and global climate patterns. As carbon dioxide levels stabilized at concentrations that were still lower than pre-forest levels, but high enough to support robust photosynthesis, the extreme cooling that had driven massive glaciation began to moderate. Ice sheets that had covered vast areas of the southern continents started to retreat, though this process unfolded over millions of years rather than the rapid timescales that characterize modern climate change. The retreat of continental ice sheets had cascading effects throughout the Earth system. Sea levels began to rise gradually as water that had been locked up in glacial ice returned to the oceans. Coastlines that had been exposed during the height of the Ice Age became submerged once again, creating new shallow marine habitats that could support diverse communities of marine organisms. Ocean circulation patterns also began to shift as the extreme temperature differences between ice-covered and ice-free regions moderated. The deep water formation that had been driven by intense polar cooling continued to operate, but with less extreme temperature contrast driving the circulation. This more moderate circulation pattern helped to distribute heat more evenly around the planet, reducing some of the climatic instability that had characterized the peak of the Ice Age. The marine ecosystems that had been severely disrupted by extreme sea level fluctuations and ocean chemistry changes began to show signs of recovery and renewed diversification. Shallow water communities, which had been repeatedly destroyed and re-established as sea levels rose and fell, found more stable conditions that allowed for the development of complex ecological relationships. Coral reef communities, which had been virtually eliminated during the most severe phases of the climate crisis, began to re-establish themselves in tropical shallow waters. These new reef ecosystems were built by different groups of organisms than their carboniferous predecessors, reflecting the evolutionary innovations that had emerged during the period of environmental stress. The corals and other reef-building organisms that dominated these new communities had evolved more efficient mechanisms for extracting calcium carbonate from seawater and for coping with the chemical changes that had affected ocean composition. The recovery of marine productivity had important implications for global carbon cycling, as healthy ocean ecosystems played crucial roles in processing atmospheric carbon dioxide. Marine photosynthesis by phytoplankton and other microscopic organisms helped to balance terrestrial carbon fixation, while the formation of carbonate shells and skeletons by marine animals provided another pathway for removing carbon from the ocean atmosphere system. On land, the moderating climate allowed forest ecosystems to expand into regions that had been too cold or dry to support tree growth during the height of the Ice Age. The seed plants that had evolved during the climate crisis proved remarkably well adapted to colonizing these newly available habitats, spreading across vast areas of previously barren landscape with an efficiency that would have been impossible for their spore-bearing predecessors. These expanding forests developed distinct regional characteristics based on local climate and geological conditions. In areas that remained relatively cool and moist, early conifer communities became established, their needle-like leaves and waxy coatings providing excellent protection against both cold temperatures and water loss. These coniferous forests developed their own unique ecological characteristics, supporting communities of organisms that were specifically adapted to the chemical environment created by conifer needle litter and the acidic soils that developed beneath conifer canopies. In warmer and more humid regions, more diverse forest communities emerged that included early representatives of many plant groups that would eventually give rise to modern forest trees. These mixed forests contained dozens of different tree species, each occupying slightly different ecological niches based on their tolerance for various environmental conditions. Some species specialized in growing on well-drained upland soils, while others thrived in the moister conditions of valley bottoms and streamside environments. The expansion of forest cover across previously barren landscapes had positive feedback effects on regional climate stability that helped to accelerate the recovery from the global climate crisis. Forest canopies moderated local temperature extremes by providing shade during hot periods and insulation during cold periods. The transpiration of water vapor from millions of tree leaves increased local humidity and contributed to more regular precipitation patterns. Tree roots also played crucial roles in stabilizing soils and reducing erosion, maintaining the landscape stability that was essential for supporting diverse plant and animal communities. The extensive root systems of mature trees helped to bind soil particles together and create networks of channels that allowed rainwater to infiltrate into the ground rather than running off the surface. This improved water infiltration reduced both flood risks during heavy rainfall and drought stress during dry periods. The water cycle in forested landscapes became more complex and better regulated as forest ecosystems matured. Trees intercepted rainfall in their canopies and released it gradually to the soil below, creating more stable soil moisture conditions that could support a greater diversity of plant and animal life. The organic matter that accumulated in forest soils acted like a sponge, storing water during wet periods and releasing it slowly during dry spells. These hydrological modifications helped to buffer forest ecosystems against climate fluctuations that might otherwise have caused severe ecological disruption. Even when regional climate conditions shifted significantly, the moderating influence of forest vegetation helped to maintain environmental conditions within ranges that established plant and animal communities could tolerate. The vertebrate communities that inhabited these stabilizing and expanding forest ecosystems continued to diversify and develop increasingly sophisticated ecological relationships. Reptile groups that had originated during the climate crisis began to explore new evolutionary pathways that would eventually lead to some of the most successful vertebrate lineages in Earth's history. Early synapsids, the group that would eventually give rise to mammals, began to develop more efficient metabolic systems and more sophisticated mechanisms for regulating body temperature. These innovations allowed them to remain active in cooler conditions than their cold-blooded contemporaries, giving them access to ecological opportunities that were unavailable to other vertebrate groups. Some synapside lineages evolved as specialized herbivores that could process the tough, fibrous plant materials that were becoming increasingly common in forest ecosystems. These early plant eaters developed more complex tooth structures and digestive systems that allowed them to extract nutrients from leaves, stems, and other plant parts that were difficult to digest. The evolution of efficient herbivory opened up entirely new ecological niches and supported much larger terrestrial animal populations than had been possible when all vertebrates were carnivorous or insectivorous. The predators that fed on these diversifying herbivore communities also became more diverse and ecologically specialized. Some evolved as ambush predators that could hide in dense forest vegetation and attack prey that passed within striking distance. Others became pursuit predators with enhanced sensory systems and locomotory abilities that allowed them to track and chase prey through complex forest environments. The arms race between predators and prey drove evolutionary innovations in both sensory perception and defensive mechanisms. Herbivorous animals evolved better hearing, vision, and smell to detect approaching predators, while predators developed more sensitive sensory systems to locate and track their prey. Some herbivores evolved defensive structures like armor plating or sharp spines, while others relied on speed and agility to escape from predators. Insect communities in these recovering forest ecosystems reached unprecedented levels of diversity and ecological complexity. The high oxygen concentrations that had characterized the Carboniferous continued into the early Permian, supporting populations of giant arthropods that served as both predators and prey in forest food webs. These massive insects occupied ecological roles that would later be filled by vertebrate animals in lower oxygen environments. Giant dragonflies with wingspans approaching 3 feet patrolled forest clearings and wetland margins, hunting smaller insects and even small vertebrates. Their enormous compound eyes and powerful flight muscles made them supremely effective aerial predators, capable of capturing prey in flight with remarkable precision. These aerial giants were supported by equally impressive terrestrial arthropods, including millipedes that could reach lengths of 6 feet and scorpions with bodies over 2 feet long. The relationship between these giant arthropods and the forest ecosystems they inhabited was complex and mutually beneficial. The arthropods served as important pollinators for many plant species, transferring pollen between individuals as they fed on plant secretions. They also played crucial roles as decomposers, breaking down dead plant and animal material and recycling nutrients back into forest soils. Plant-insect interactions became increasingly sophisticated during this period of forest expansion and diversification. Many plants evolved chemical defenses against insect herbivory, producing toxic or distasteful compounds that could deter feeding. Insects, in turn, evolved detoxification mechanisms that allowed them to overcome these plant defenses, leading to evolutionary arms races that drove innovation in both plant chemistry and insect physiology. Some plants developed more subtle strategies for dealing with insect herbivores, evolving structures and chemical signals that could attract predatory insects to attack herbivorous species. These early examples of indirect plant defense represented sophisticated ecological strategies that required precise coordination between chemical signaling, insect behavior, and predator-prey dynamics. The pollination relationships between insects and plants also became more complex and specialized during this period. While true flowers had not yet evolved, many plants developed colorful or fragrant structures that could attract specific types of insects for pollen or spore dispersal. Some insects evolved specialized mouthparts and sensory systems that allowed them to efficiently collect pollen or nectar from particular plant species. These coevolutionary relationships between plants and their insect partners helped to maintain plant diversity and reproductive success in the face of changing environmental conditions. Plants that had evolved effective relationships with insect pollinators were more likely to successfully reproduce and establish new populations, while insects that had developed efficient strategies for locating and exploiting plant resources were more likely to survive and reproduce. The soil communities that developed in these maturing forest ecosystems were among the most complex and productive biological systems that had ever existed on Earth. The leaf litter that accumulated on forest floors provided habitat and food resources for countless species of fungi, bacteria, and invertebrate decomposers. These organisms formed intricate food webs that processed dead organic material and recycled nutrients back into forms that living plants could use. Mycorrhizal associations between plant roots and soil fungi became increasingly diverse and sophisticated during this period of forest development. Different types of fungi evolved specialized relationships with different groups of plants, creating networks of resource exchange that could span entire forest communities. These fungal networks helped plants access nutrients from distant soil locations and facilitated the sharing of resources between individual trees. The physical structure of forest soils also became more complex and layered during this period. Distinct soil horizons developed as organic matter accumulated at the surface. Minerals leached from upper layers concentrated in deeper zones, and chemical weathering processes created gradients of pH and nutrient availability throughout the soil profile. These structured soil environments provided habitat for a much greater diversity of soil organisms than had been possible in the simple, poorly developed soils of earlier terrestrial ecosystems. Earthworms and other soil invertebrates played increasingly important roles in mixing organic matter with mineral soil particles and creating the aggregated soil structure that could support healthy plant growth. These soil engineers physically transformed the underground environment, creating networks of channels and chambers that improved water infiltration, air movement, and root penetration through the soil profile. The seasonal patterns that characterized many forest ecosystems added temporal complexity to these already intricate ecological systems. In regions with pronounced seasonal climate variations, forest organisms evolved life cycles that were synchronized with predictable changes in temperature, precipitation, and resource availability. Deciduous trees, which shed their leaves each autumn in response to shortening day length and cooling temperatures, created massive annual pulses of organic matter input to forest soils. The decomposition of these leaf litter inputs supported bursts of microbial activity that released nutrients at precisely the times when plants were preparing for their next growing season. This tight coupling between plant phenology and nutrient cycling made forest ecosystems much more efficient at retaining and recycling essential elements. Many forest animals also evolved seasonal behavior patterns that allowed them to take advantage of predictable changes in resource availability. Some species developed the ability to store food during periods of abundance for use during leaner times, while others evolved migration patterns that allowed them to follow seasonal resources across the landscape. The reproductive cycles of many forest organisms became synchronized with seasonal patterns in ways that maximized the survival of offspring. Many plant species timed their seed production to coincide with favorable conditions for germination and seedling establishment, while many animal species timed their breeding to ensure that their young would be born during periods when food was most abundant. These seasonal adaptations contributed to the stability and resilience of forest ecosystems by creating predictable patterns of resource use and population dynamics. Even when environmental conditions fluctuated from year to year, the underlying seasonal framework provided a structure that allowed forest communities to maintain their essential functions and relationships. The geographic expansion of forest ecosystems during the recovery from the late Carboniferous Ice Age also contributed to global environmental stability in ways that extended far beyond local ecological effects. As forests spread across previously barren continental surfaces, they began to influence large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns and regional climate systems. Forested landscapes had different thermal properties than bare rock or sparse vegetation, absorbing more solar radiation during the day and releasing heat more gradually at night. These thermal modifications helped to moderate temperature extremes and created more stable local climate conditions that could support diverse biological communities. The water vapor transpired by forest vegetation also contributed to regional precipitation patterns, creating positive feedback loops that helped to maintain forest cover even during periods of regional climate stress. Areas with extensive forest cover tended to receive more rainfall than deforested regions, partly because the moisture released by trees contributed to local humidity and cloud formation. These climate-moderating effects of forests help to stabilize regional environmental conditions and reduce the amplitude of climate fluctuations that might otherwise have disrupted ecological communities. The expansion of forest cover during the recovery from the Ice Age created a more buffered and stable global climate system that was less prone to the extreme oscillations that had characterized the peak of the climate crisis. The biogeochemical cycles that operated in these expanding and stabilizing forest ecosystems also reached new levels of complexity and integration. The carbon cycle, which had been so severely disrupted during the period of massive coal formation, achieved a more sustainable balance between carbon fixation through photosynthesis and carbon release through decomposition and respiration. The nitrogen cycle also became more sophisticated as diverse communities of nitrogen-fixing bacteria evolved symbiotic relationships with different types of forest plants. These partnerships allowed forests to maintain high productivity, even on soils that were naturally low in available nitrogen, expanding the range of environments where forest communities could successfully establish and persist. Phosphorus cycling, which had been relatively simple in earlier ecosystems, became much more complex as the diverse root systems and mycorrhizal networks of forest communities developed new mechanisms for accessing and recycling this essential but often limiting nutrient. Some plants evolved specialized root structures that could efficiently extract phosphorus from rock minerals, while others developed partnerships with fungi that could access organic phosphorus compounds in soil organic matter. The sulfur cycle also became more intricate as the diverse chemical environments created by different plant species led to the evolution of specialized sulfur processing microorganisms. These microbial communities could transform sulfur compounds between different oxidation states, making sulfur available to plants in forms they could readily absorb and use for protein synthesis. The integration of these biogeochemical cycles with the physical processes of weathering, erosion, and soil formation created Earth's first truly mature terrestrial ecosystems. These forests represented a new level of biological organization that had never existed before, characterized by complex feedbacks between living organisms and their physical environment that helped to maintain stable conditions suitable for diverse biological communities. The evolutionary innovations that had emerged during the climate crisis of the late Carboniferous continued to influence the development of these recovering forest ecosystems. Seed plants, which had proven so successful during the environmental upheaval, continued to diversify and occupy new ecological niches as environmental conditions stabilized. Early conifers developed increasingly sophisticated reproductive strategies, with some species evolving wind-dispersed seeds that could colonize distant habitats, while others produced large, nutrient-rich seeds that could support seedling establishment in challenging environments. The evolution of different seed types allowed conifer communities to spread across a wide range of environmental conditions and become dominant components of forest ecosystems in many regions. Other groups of seed plants also continued to evolve and diversify during this period of environmental recovery. Early cycads developed large palm-like leaves and complex reproductive structures that would make them important components of many forest communities. Seed ferns, which were neither true ferns nor modern seed plants, but rather an extinct group that combined characteristics of both, became diverse and ecologically important during the Permian period. The vertebrate lineages that had survived the climate crisis also continued to evolve and radiate into new ecological roles. Reptile groups that had originated during the environmental upheaval began to diversify rapidly as environmental conditions stabilized and new ecological opportunities became available. Some reptile lineages evolved as large herbivores that could process the increasingly diverse plant communities that characterized recovering forest ecosystems. These early herbivorous reptiles developed complex dental batteries and sophisticated digestive systems that allowed them to extract nutrients from tough, fibrous plant materials. Their success as large herbivores helped to shape forest community structure by creating grazing pressures that influenced plant species composition and ecosystem dynamics. Other reptile groups evolved as large predators that could hunt the diverse communities of herbivorous animals that inhabited forest ecosystems. These predatory reptiles developed enhanced sensory systems, powerful jaw muscles, and sophisticated hunting behaviors that made them effective apex predators in terrestrial environments. The amphibians that had survived the transition from coal swamp to forest ecosystems also continued to evolve and adapt to changing environmental conditions. While their continued dependence on water for reproduction limited their ecological options compared to reptiles, many amphibian groups found successful niches in forest stream and pond environments. Some amphibians evolved as specialized predators in aquatic environments, developing powerful jaws and streamlined body forms that made them effective hunters of fish and aquatic invertebrates. Others became adapted to terrestrial forest environments, evolving more efficient skin for gas exchange and water retention that allowed them to venture further from water sources. The recovery and stabilization of forest ecosystems during the Permian period represented a turning point in the history of life on Earth. The extreme environmental conditions that had characterized the climate crisis of the late Carboniferous gave way to more moderate and stable conditions that could support increasingly complex and diverse biological communities. The forests that emerged from this period of environmental upheaval were fundamentally different from the coal swamps that had preceded them. They were more diverse in their species composition, more complex in their ecological structure, and more resilient to environmental fluctuations. These characteristics would make them better adapted to the environmental challenges that lay ahead, including the even more severe disruptions that would characterize the end Permian mass extinction. The lessons learned during the Great Climate Crisis of the Carboniferous would prove invaluable for understanding how biological systems respond to rapid environmental change. The forests that had inadvertently triggered global cooling through their massive carbon sequestration had also demonstrated the remarkable capacity of life to adapt and evolve in response to changing conditions. The carbon that had been sequestered so effectively during the coal-forming period remained locked in underground deposits, removed from active participation in the carbon cycle until much later in Earth's history. These coal deposits would eventually become one of the most important energy sources for human civilization, representing stored solar energy that had been captured by ancient forests hundreds of millions of years earlier. The irony that the same carbon sequestration process that had once driven the planet toward dangerous cooling would eventually contribute to modern global warming through human fossil fuel combustion represents one of the most striking examples of how Earth's environmental history continues to influence contemporary climate dynamics. The ancient forests that had once removed so much carbon from the atmosphere that they nearly froze the planet had unknowingly created the energy resources that would later enable human civilization to alter the climate in the opposite direction. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter in Earth's environmental history, we find ourselves witnessing a profound demonstration of how biological processes can become geological forces capable of reshaping planetary environments. The trees that had colonized the land with such evolutionary success had triggered a cascade of environmental changes that ultimately transformed the entire Earth system. The climate crisis that resulted from their massive carbon sequestration had forced life to adapt and evolve in ways that would have been impossible under the stable conditions that had previously characterized terrestrial environments. The evolutionary innovations that emerged during this period of environmental stress would continue to influence the development of terrestrial ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. The forests that recovered from the Great Climate Crisis were not simply replacements for what had been lost, but represented entirely new forms of biological organization that were better adapted to the changed world they inhabited. Their legacy would be written not only in the geological record of coal deposits and glacial sediments, but in the very structure and function of all subsequent terrestrial ecosystems. In the quiet depths of geological time, the story of how trees almost destroyed the climate stands as a testament to both the power and the resilience of life on Earth. It reminds us that environmental change, even when severe and disruptive, can ultimately lead to new forms of stability and complexity that enrich the biosphere in ways that were previously impossible. The gentle rhythm of evolution and adaptation continues to unfold across the vast expanses of deep time, carrying forward the lessons learned during Earth's most profound environmental transformations. Oceans. The profound environmental changes that had reshaped our planet during the recovery from the Great Cooling were now approaching their own natural conclusion. As the Permian period drew toward its end, the Earth system that had been so dramatically altered by the rise of the first forests was finally achieving a new form of equilibrium, one that would define the character of terrestrial life for millions of years to come. The atmospheric composition that had undergone such violent swings during the height of the forest-driven climate crisis had gradually settled into more stable patterns. Carbon dioxide concentrations, which had plummeted from dangerous heights to near-starvation levels for plant life, now fluctuated within a range that could sustain robust photosynthesis while avoiding the extreme carbon burial that had triggered the original cooling. The balance between carbon fixation and carbon release had found a more sustainable rhythm, mediated by the increasingly efficient decomposer communities that had evolved to process the complex organic compounds produced by seed plants. This stabilization of the carbon cycle reflected a fundamental maturation in the relationship between terrestrial life and the planet's chemical systems. The early forests had operated almost as geological accidents, sequestering carbon at rates that the Earth system could not sustainably support. The ecosystems that emerged from the subsequent climate upheaval represented something entirely different. Integrated biological communities that had learned, through millions of years of environmental selection, to maintain their essential functions without destabilizing the planetary systems that supported them. The oxygen levels that had climbed to unprecedented heights during the Carboniferous began to moderate as the carbon cycle found its new equilibrium. While atmospheric oxygen remained elevated compared to earlier periods in Earth's history, it no longer reached the extreme concentrations that had enabled giant arthropods to dominate terrestrial ecosystems. This gradual decline in oxygen levels coincided with significant changes in the animal communities that inhabited forest environments. The massive dragonflies and millipedes that had thrived in the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Carboniferous found themselves increasingly constrained by the changing atmospheric conditions. Species that had grown to enormous sizes began to face physiological limits as the diffusion of oxygen through their simple respiratory systems became less efficient. Over time, the average size of terrestrial arthropods decreased significantly, though this process unfolded gradually across millions of years rather than through any sudden collapse. The vertebrate communities that had been evolving alongside these changing atmospheric conditions proved more adaptable to the moderating oxygen levels. Reptiles, with their more sophisticated respiratory systems and metabolic flexibility, continued to diversify and occupy new ecological roles even as atmospheric composition shifted. Some lineages evolved enhanced oxygen-carrying capacity in their blood, while others developed more efficient mechanisms for extracting oxygen from the air. The synapsid reptiles that would eventually give rise to mammals showed particularly remarkable adaptations during this period of atmospheric transition. Many developed more active metabolisms that could function effectively across a wider range of oxygen concentrations. Some evolved more complex respiratory systems with improved gas exchange surfaces, while others developed behavioral strategies that allowed them to remain active even when atmospheric conditions were less favorable. These metabolic innovations had profound implications for ecosystem dynamics, as vertebrates with more active metabolisms could exploit resources more efficiently and maintain larger population sizes than their cold-blooded competitors. The increasing dominance of warm-blooded vertebrates would eventually transform terrestrial food webs, creating the foundation for the complex mammalian ecosystems that would characterize later periods of Earth's history. The plant communities that had survived the Great Climate Crisis continue to evolve and diversify as environmental conditions stabilized. Seed plants, which had proven so successful during the period of environmental upheaval, began to explore new evolutionary pathways that would eventually lead to the flowering plants that dominate modern terrestrial ecosystems. Early angiosperms began to experiment with new reproductive strategies, developing more efficient pollination mechanisms and more sophisticated seed dispersal systems. The conifers that had become dominant in many forest ecosystems also continued to evolve and refine their adaptations to the post-crisis environment. Some species developed more efficient needle structures that could photosynthesize effectively even under the changing atmospheric conditions. Others evolved more sophisticated root systems that could access water and nutrients from increasingly complex soil environments. The soil ecosystems that had developed during the recovery from the climate crisis reached new levels of complexity and integration. The microbial communities that inhabited forest soils became increasingly diverse and specialized, with different groups of bacteria and fungi evolving to process different types of organic compounds. These specialized decomposer communities created more efficient nutrient cycling processes that could support higher levels of plant productivity while maintaining more stable carbon cycling. Mycorrhizal networks in forest soils also became more extensive and sophisticated during this period of ecological maturation. The fungal partnerships that connected individual trees expanded into forest-wide networks that could facilitate resource sharing across entire ecosystems. These underground communication and resource sharing networks helped forest communities respond more effectively to environmental stresses and maintain their stability even when faced with changing conditions. The physical structure of forest soils continued to develop and mature as the complex interactions between plant roots, soil organisms, and geological processes created increasingly sophisticated soil profiles. Well-developed soil horizons became standard features of forest ecosystems, with distinct layers specialized for different functions such as organic matter accumulation, nutrient processing, and mineral weathering. These mature soil systems provided the foundation for the diverse plant communities that characterized post-crisis forests. Different plant species could exploit different soil layers and nutrient sources, creating the vertical stratification of resources that supported the complex canopy structures and high species diversity that became hallmarks of mature forest ecosystems. The hydrological cycles that operated in these mature forest environments also reached new levels of sophistication and efficiency. Forest canopies became increasingly effective at intercepting and regulating precipitation, creating more stable soil moisture conditions that could support diverse plant and animal communities even during periods of climatic variability. The water that was transpired by forest vegetation played increasingly important roles in regional climate regulation, contributing to local humidity and precipitation patterns that helped maintain forest cover across large geographic areas. These positive feedback relationships between forest vegetation and regional climate created more resilient ecosystems that could persist through moderate environmental changes. Stream and river systems in forested watersheds also developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the influence of mature forest communities. Forest streams became more thermally stable as canopy cover regulated water temperatures, while the input of organic matter from surrounding forests created complex aquatic food webs that supported diverse communities of fish and aquatic invertebrates. The seasonal patterns that characterized many forest ecosystems became more pronounced and predictable as forest communities matured and atmospheric conditions stabilized. Trees and other forest organisms evolved increasingly sophisticated responses to seasonal changes in temperature, precipitation, and day length, creating the synchronized ecological rhythms that characterize mature temperate and boreal forest systems. Deciduous trees developed more efficient mechanisms for nutrient resorption before leaf drop, allowing them to recover valuable elements from their leaves before shedding them. This improved nutrient conservation made deciduous forests more efficient at retaining essential elements and reduced their dependence on external nutrient inputs from weathering and atmospheric deposition. Evergreen conifers also refined their strategies for surviving seasonal extremes, developing more effective mechanisms for protecting their photosynthetic tissues from freezing damage and maintaining metabolic activity during cold periods. These adaptations allowed coniferous forests to expand into regions with more severe winter conditions than had been possible for earlier forest types. The animal communities that inhabited these seasonally dynamic forests evolved increasingly complex behavioral and physiological adaptations to cope with predictable changes in resource availability. Many species developed sophisticated strategies for food storage and energy conservation that allowed them to survive periods when food was scarce or environmental conditions were challenging. Migration patterns also became more complex and predictable as animal communities learned to track seasonal resources across larger geographic areas. Some species evolved the ability to navigate across vast distances using celestial cues, magnetic fields, and other environmental signals, allowing them to exploit resources that were available in different locations at different times of the year. The pollination and seed dispersal relationships that connected plants and animals in these mature forest ecosystems reached unprecedented levels of complexity and specificity. Many plant species evolved specialized relationships with particular animal partners, developing flowers, fruits, and other structures that were precisely adapted to attract and reward their animal collaborators. These co-evolutionary partnerships created intricate webs of interdependence that helped stabilize forest ecosystems and maintain their diversity, even in the face of environmental changes. Plants that had evolved effective partnerships with animal pollinators and seed dispersers were more likely to maintain viable populations, while animals that had developed efficient strategies for exploiting plant resources were more likely to survive and reproduce successfully. The fire ecology of forest ecosystems also became more sophisticated as plant and animal communities adapted to the periodic disturbances that were an inevitable part of forest life. Many plant species evolved specific adaptations to fire, including thick bark that could protect vital tissues, the ability to resprout from roots after above-ground parts were burned, and seeds that required fire-related cues for germination. Animal communities also developed strategies for surviving and even benefiting from forest fires. Some species learned to flee fires and return to burned areas to exploit the new resources that became available, while others evolved behaviors that allowed them to take advantage of the increased visibility and reduce competition that followed fire disturbances. These fire adaptations helped forest ecosystems maintain their diversity and productivity by preventing any single group of species from completely dominating forest communities. Periodic fires created openings that allowed light-demanding species to establish and grow, while also recycling nutrients that had been tied up in accumulated organic matter. The geographic distribution of forest ecosystems continued to expand during this period of environmental stabilization, as the moderating climate allowed trees to colonize regions that had been too cold or dry during the height of the Ice Age. Different types of forest communities developed in different climatic zones, creating the diverse array of forest types that would characterize the post-Paleozoic world. Tropical forests began to develop in equatorial regions, where warm, humid conditions persisted year-round. These forests evolved high species diversity and complex vertical structure, with multiple canopy layers supporting specialized communities of plants and animals. The consistent climate of tropical regions allowed for the development of ecological relationships that would have been impossible in more seasonal environments. Temperate forests developed in mid-latitude regions where seasonal temperature and precipitation patterns created opportunities for deciduous trees and associated plant and animal communities. These forests evolved sophisticated mechanisms for coping with seasonal resource fluctuations, including the coordinated leaf drop and regrowth cycles that characterize modern temperate deciduous forests. Boreal forests emerged in high-latitude regions, where short-growing seasons and long, cold winters favored evergreen conifers with adaptations for surviving extreme cold. These northern forests developed their own unique ecological characteristics, including specialized soil communities adapted to processing acidic conifer litter and animal communities adapted to exploiting the resources available in coniferous forest environments. The biogeographic patterns that emerged during this period of forest expansion would influence the distribution of terrestrial life for hundreds of millions of years. Different continents developed distinctive forest communities based on their climatic conditions and geological history, creating the foundation for the biogeographic provinces that would characterize later periods of Earth's history. The evolutionary radiations that occurred within these expanding forest ecosystems produced many of the major groups of organisms that would dominate terrestrial life in subsequent geological periods. Plant lineages that had originated during the climate crisis continued to diversify and give rise to new families and genera that would become important components of future ecosystems. Vertebrate groups also continued to radiate and explore new ecological roles as forest ecosystems provided increasing opportunities for specialization. Early archosaurs began to diversify into the lineages that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs and birds, while synapsid lineages continued their evolution toward the mammalian body plan. The invertebrate communities that inhabited forest ecosystems also reached new levels of diversity and ecological complexity. Insects in particular began to exploit the increasing variety of ecological niches available in mature forest environments, leading to evolutionary radiations that would eventually produce the enormous diversity of insect species that characterizes modern terrestrial ecosystems. The pollination relationships between insects and plants became increasingly sophisticated during this period, with many insect groups evolving specialized mouthparts and sensory systems for exploiting particular types of flowers or reproductive structures. These co-evolutionary partnerships drove innovation in both plant reproductive biology and insect sensory and feeding systems. Decomposer communities in forest soils also continued to diversify and specialize, with different groups of fungi and bacteria evolving to process different types of organic compounds. These specialized decomposer communities created more efficient nutrient cycling processes that could support higher levels of ecosystem productivity while maintaining stable carbon and nutrient cycles. The integration of all these biological innovations created forest ecosystems that were far more complex and sophisticated than anything that had existed during the early phases of terrestrial colonization. These mature forest communities represented a new level of biological organization that had emerged through millions of years of evolution under changing environmental conditions. The climate system that supported these complex forest ecosystems had also reached a new level of stability and predictability. The extreme fluctuations that had characterized the height of the forest-driven climate crisis had given way to more moderate oscillations that forest communities could accommodate without experiencing severe disruption. Regional climate patterns became more regular and predictable as the global distribution of forest cover helped to moderate temperature extremes and stabilize precipitation patterns. The water vapor transpired by forests contributed to regional humidity and cloud formation, creating positive feedback loops that helped maintain forest cover even during periods of climatic stress. Ocean circulation patterns also stabilized as the extreme temperature contrasts that had driven intense circulation during the Ice Age moderated. More regular ocean circulation helped to distribute heat more evenly around the planet, contributing to the more stable climate conditions that supported diverse forest ecosystems across a wide range of latitudes. The carbon cycle that operated in these stabilized Earth systems represented a fundamental improvement over the unstable carbon cycling that had characterized earlier periods. The balance between carbon fixation through photosynthesis and carbon release through decomposition and weathering had reached a sustainable equilibrium that could support high levels of biological productivity without destabilizing atmospheric composition. This mature carbon cycle was supported by the sophisticated decomposer communities that had evolved to process the diverse organic compounds produced by complex forest ecosystems. Unlike the early forests that had sequestered carbon at unsustainable rates, these mature forest communities maintained more balanced relationships between carbon storage and carbon release. The nitrogen and phosphorus cycles that operated in mature forest ecosystems also reached new levels of efficiency and integration. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria formed increasingly sophisticated partnerships with forest plants, while mycorrhizal fungi developed more effective strategies for accessing and sharing phosphorus and other essential nutrients. These efficient nutrient cycles allowed forest ecosystems to maintain high productivity, even on soils that were naturally low in available nutrients, expanding the range of environments where forest communities could successfully establish and persist. The tight coupling between nutrient availability and plant growth also helped to regulate ecosystem productivity and prevent the kind of runaway growth that had characterized some earlier forest communities. The overall stability and resilience of these mature Earth systems represented a remarkable achievement in the history of life on our planet. Through millions of years of environmental upheaval and evolutionary innovation, terrestrial life had learned to create and maintain complex ecosystems that could support enormous biological diversity while remaining in harmony with the planetary systems that sustained them. The forests that had emerged from the great climate crisis of the Carboniferous were not simply recovered versions of what had existed before, but represented entirely new forms of biological organization that were better adapted to the complex environmental conditions of the post-crisis world. These mature forest ecosystems would provide the foundation for all subsequent developments in terrestrial life. The legacy of the climate crisis that had been triggered by the first forests would continue to influence Earth's environmental history for hundreds of millions of years. The coal deposits that had formed from the massive carbon burial of the Carboniferous period would remain locked underground, representing a vast reservoir of stored carbon that would eventually play important roles in both geological processes and, much later, human civilization. The evolutionary innovations that had emerged during the period of environmental upheaval would continue to shape the development of terrestrial life. The seed plants that had evolved during the crisis would eventually give rise to all of the major groups of land plants that dominate modern ecosystems, while the vertebrate lineages that had survived the upheaval would continue to diversify into the remarkable array of animal life that characterizes contemporary terrestrial environments. The soil communities and biogeochemical cycles that had developed during the recovery from the climate crisis would provide the foundation for all subsequent terrestrial ecosystems. The complex relationships between plants, soil organisms, and geological processes that had emerged during this period would continue to operate in modified forms throughout the rest of Earth's history. Perhaps most importantly, the great climate crisis of the Carboniferous had demonstrated that biological processes could become geological forces capable of reshaping entire planetary systems. This recognition would prove crucial for understanding not only the history of Earth's climate system, but also the potential for biological activities to influence global environmental conditions in the future. The story of how trees almost destroyed the climate stands as one of the most remarkable examples of unintended consequences in Earth's environmental history. The forests that had colonized the land with such evolutionary success had inadvertently triggered a cascade of environmental changes that transformed the entire planet, forcing life to adapt and evolve in ways that would have been impossible under previous conditions. The recovery from this ancient climate crisis had ultimately produced a more diverse and resilient biosphere, one that was better equipped to handle environmental challenges while maintaining the essential functions that support complex life. The lessons learned during this period of upheaval would continue to resonate through the depths of geological time, shaping the character of terrestrial life for eons to come. In the quiet rhythm of deep time, where millions of years pass like seasons, the great transformation triggered by Earth's first forests had run its course. The planet that had once teetered on the edge of a climate catastrophe had found its way back to stability, carrying with it the hard-won wisdom of evolution and the enduring legacy of life's remarkable capacity for renewal and adaptation. As we continue our journey through these transforming epochs, we find ourselves witnessing the gradual emergence of something entirely unprecedented in the history of our planet. The environmental upheaval that had reshaped terrestrial life was now giving way to a period of extraordinary biological innovation, one that would establish the fundamental patterns of ecosystem organization that persist to this day. The Permian period unfolded across landscapes that bore little resemblance to the waterlogged coal swamps of earlier times, where once vast expanses of standing water had supported towering lycopsids. Now well-drained soils stretched across continental interiors, supporting diverse communities of seed plants that had learned to thrive in more seasonal and variable conditions. These new forest ecosystems operated according to principles that would seem familiar to any modern ecologist, with complex food webs, efficient nutrient cycling, and sophisticated relationships between plants and their animal partners. The trees that dominated these post-crisis forests represented evolutionary lineages that had been forged in the crucible of climate upheaval. Early conifers spread across vast regions, their needle-shaped leaves and waxy surfaces providing excellent protection against both cold temperatures and water loss. These adaptations allowed coniferous forests to expand into environments that would have been impossible for their spore-bearing predecessors to colonize, including regions with harsh winters and irregular precipitation patterns. In more temperate zones, diverse communities of seed plants created the first truly modern-looking forests. These ecosystems contain dozens of different tree species, each occupying specific ecological niches based on their tolerance for various soil conditions, moisture levels, and light availability. Some species specialized in growing along stream corridors where water was consistently available, while others adapted to the drier conditions of upland slopes and ridge tops. The understory layers of these forests harbored an entirely new category of plant life. Shrubs and herbaceous plants evolved to exploit the filtered light conditions beneath forest canopies, developing specialized leaf structures and growth forms that allowed them to photosynthesize efficiently in low-light environments. These understory communities created additional layers of habitat complexity that supported diverse animal populations and contributed to the overall productivity of forest ecosystems. The soil systems that developed beneath these mature forests represented perhaps the most profound transformation of the terrestrial environment that had yet occurred. The simple, poorly developed substrates that had characterized earlier terrestrial ecosystems gave way to complex, layered soil profiles with distinct horizons specialized for different ecological functions. The uppermost layers became rich in decomposing organic matter and the microorganisms that processed it, while deeper layers showed the chemical effects of root activity and mineral weathering. These mature soils functioned as vast living systems in their own right, harboring communities of bacteria, fungi, and invertebrate animals that rivaled the complexity of above-ground ecosystems. Earthworms and other soil engineers mixed organic matter with mineral particles, creating the aggregated soil structure that could support healthy plant growth. Mycorrhizal fungi formed extensive networks that connected individual trees and facilitated the sharing of water and nutrients across entire forest communities. The carbon cycling processes that operated in these mature soil systems represented a fundamental advancement over the unstable carbon burial that had characterized the coal-forming period. Dead plant material decomposed more reliably in the better-drained soils of the new forest environments, returning carbon to the atmosphere through microbial respiration while retaining essential nutrients in forms that living plants could readily absorb and utilize. This more balanced approach to carbon cycling helped to stabilize atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations around levels that could support robust photosynthesis without triggering the massive carbon sequestration that had driven the earlier climate crisis. The Earth system had learned, through millions of years of environmental selection, to maintain the delicate balance between carbon fixation and carbon release that would become the foundation for all subsequent terrestrial ecosystems. The animal communities that inhabited these stabilizing forest environments continued to evolve in directions that would shape the character of terrestrial life for hundreds of millions of years. Reptilian lineages that had originated during the climate crisis began to explore new evolutionary pathways, some leading toward the archosaur groups that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs and birds, others toward the synapside lineages that would eventually produce mammals. Early therapsids, the advanced synapsids that represented the most direct ancestors of mammals, began to develop increasingly sophisticated metabolic systems during this period. Some species evolved more efficient mechanisms for generating and regulating body heat, allowing them to remain active during cooler periods when their cold-blooded competitors became sluggish. This metabolic innovation opened up new ecological opportunities and would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of mammalian physiology. The herbivorous reptiles that had evolved to exploit the diverse plant communities of post-crisis forests also continued to diversify and refine their feeding strategies. Some developed complex dental batteries that could efficiently process tough, fibrous plant materials, while others evolved more sophisticated digestive systems that could extract nutrients from previously indigestible plant compounds. These innovations in herbivory allowed terrestrial ecosystems to support much larger populations of plant-eating animals than had been possible in earlier periods. Predatory reptiles also became more diverse and ecologically sophisticated as their prey communities expanded and diversified. Some lineages evolved as ambush predators that could hide motionless in forest vegetation and attack prey that ventured too close. Others became pursuit predators with enhanced sensory systems and locomotory capabilities that allowed them to track and chase prey through complex forest environments. The insect communities that inhabited these evolving forest ecosystems reached unprecedented levels of diversity and ecological specialization. While the giant arthropods of the high oxygen Carboniferous were gradually declining as atmospheric oxygen levels moderated, smaller insects were diversifying rapidly and exploring new ecological roles that would eventually make them the most diverse group of animals on Earth. Flying insects became particularly important components of forest ecosystems during this period. Early beetles evolved specialized mouthparts that allowed them to exploit different types of plant tissues, from soft leaf material to hard seeds and woody stems. Primitive flies developed as decomposers and parasites, while early representatives of several other insect orders began to establish the ecological roles that their descendants would continue to occupy for hundreds of millions of years. The pollination relationships between insects and plants became increasingly sophisticated during this period of forest ecosystem development. While true flowers would not evolve for many millions of years, some seed plants had already begun to develop colorful or fragrant reproductive structures that could attract insects for pollen dispersal. These early plant-pollinator partnerships laid the groundwork for the complex co-evolutionary relationships that would eventually produce the remarkable diversity of flowering plants and their insect partners. Seed dispersal mechanisms also became more diverse and effective during this period of forest expansion. Some plants evolved seeds with wing-like structures that could travel long distances on air currents, allowing them to colonize new habitats and recover quickly from local disturbances. Others developed fleshy seed coats that attracted vertebrate animals, which would consume the seeds and deposit them in new locations along with a supply of fertilizing waste material. The seasonal rhythms that characterized many of these mature forest ecosystems added temporal complexity to already intricate ecological relationships. In regions with pronounced seasonal climate variations, both plants and animals evolved life cycles that were synchronized with predictable changes in temperature, precipitation, and resource availability. Trees developed mechanisms for sensing changes in day length and temperature that allowed them to time their growth, reproduction, and dormancy periods to coincide with optimal environmental conditions. Many forest animals also evolved seasonal behavior patterns that allowed them to exploit predictable changes in resource availability. Some species developed the ability to store food during periods of abundance for use during leaner times, while others evolved migration patterns that allowed them to follow seasonal resources across the landscape. These seasonal adaptations contributed to the stability and resilience of forest ecosystems by creating predictable patterns of resource use and population dynamics. The hydrological cycles that operated in these mature forest environments became increasingly sophisticated and effective at moderating local climate conditions. Forest canopies intercepted rainfall and released it gradually to the soil below, reducing erosion and maintaining more stable soil moisture levels. The transpiration of water vapor from millions of tree leaves contributed to local humidity and helped to maintain precipitation patterns that could support forest cover even during periods of regional climate stress. Stream and river systems in forested watersheds developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the influence of mature forest communities. Forest streams became more thermally stable as canopy cover regulated water temperatures, while inputs of organic matter from surrounding forests created complex aquatic food webs that supported diverse communities of fish and other aquatic organisms. These forested waterways served as corridors for the movement of both aquatic and terrestrial species, helping to maintain genetic connectivity between forest patches across the landscape. The phyroecology of these forest ecosystems also became more sophisticated as plant and animal communities adapted to the periodic disturbances that were an inevitable part of forest life. Many plant species evolved specific adaptations to survive and even benefit from fires, including thick bark that could protect vital tissues from heat damage and the ability to resprout from root systems after above-ground parts had been consumed by flames. Some plant species became dependent on fire for successful reproduction, evolving seeds that would only germinate after exposure to the heat or chemical compounds produced during forest fires. These fire-adapted plants help to maintain forest diversity by creating opportunities for light-demanding species to establish in the openings created by fires, while also recycling nutrients that had become tied up in accumulated organic matter. Animal communities also developed strategies for surviving and exploiting the resources that became available after forest fires. Some species learned to flee approaching fires and return to burned areas to feed on insects and other small animals that had been killed or displaced by the flames. Others evolved behaviors that allowed them to take advantage of the increased visibility and reduced competition that characterized recently burned forest areas. The geographic expansion of forest ecosystems during this period of environmental stabilization created the foundation for the biogeographic patterns that would characterize terrestrial life for hundreds of millions of years. Different regions of the world developed distinctive forest communities based on their climatic conditions, geological history, and geographic isolation from other forest areas. Tropical forest communities began to emerge in equatorial regions where warm, humid conditions persisted throughout the year. These forests evolved high species diversity and complex vertical structure, with multiple canopy layers supporting specialized communities of plants and animals adapted to different light levels and microenvironmental conditions. The consistent climate of tropical regions allowed for the development of ecological relationships and evolutionary specializations that would have been impossible in more seasonally variable environments. Temperate forest communities developed in mid-latitude regions, where seasonal temperature and precipitation patterns created distinct growing seasons and periods of winter dormancy. These forests evolved sophisticated mechanisms for coping with seasonal resource fluctuations, including the coordinated leaf drop and regrowth cycles that would eventually characterize modern temperate deciduous forests. In higher latitude regions where growing seasons were short and winter conditions were severe, boreal forest communities emerged that were dominated by evergreen conifers with adaptations for surviving extreme cold. These northern forests developed their own unique ecological characteristics, including specialized soil communities adapted to processing acidic conifer litter, and animal communities adapted to exploiting the resources available during brief summer growing seasons. The biogeochemical cycles that operated in these diverse forest ecosystems reached new levels of efficiency and integration, as different plant and microbial communities evolved specialized roles in processing different elements. The nitrogen cycle became more complex as diverse communities of nitrogen-fixing bacteria formed partnerships with various types of forest plants, allowing forests to maintain high productivity even on soils that were naturally low in available nitrogen. Phosphorus cycling also became more sophisticated as plants and their fungal partners developed new strategies for accessing this often limiting nutrient. Some plant species evolved specialized root structures that could efficiently extract phosphorus from rock minerals, while others developed partnerships with mycorrhizal fungi that could access organic phosphorus compounds in soil organic matter and transfer them to plant roots in exchange for carbohydrates. The sulfur cycle became more intricate as the diverse chemical environments created by different plant species led to the evolution of specialized sulfur processing microorganisms. These microbial communities could transform sulfur compounds between different oxidation states, making sulfur available to plants in forms they could readily absorb and incorporate into proteins and other essential biochemical compounds. The integration of these biogeochemical cycles with the physical processes of weathering, erosion, and soil formation created truly mature terrestrial ecosystems that represented a new level of biological organization. These forest communities were characterized by complex feedbacks between living organisms and their physical environment that helped to maintain stable conditions suitable for diverse biological communities over long periods of time. The atmospheric composition that had undergone such dramatic changes during the forest-driven climate crisis continued to stabilize around new equilibrium points as these mature ecosystems became established across large areas of the continental surfaces. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated within ranges that could support robust photosynthesis while avoiding the extreme carbon burial that had triggered the original cooling event. Oxygen concentrations also moderated from the peak levels that had characterized the Carboniferous period, settling at concentrations that could support diverse animal communities while avoiding the extreme fire hazards that had been associated with the highest oxygen levels. This more moderate atmospheric composition created conditions that were suitable for the continued evolution and diversification of both plant and animal communities. The climate system that supported these diverse forest ecosystems had achieved a new level of stability and predictability compared to the extreme fluctuations that had characterized the height of the climate crisis. Regional climate patterns became more regular as the global distribution of forest cover helped to moderate temperature extremes and stabilize precipitation patterns through the water, vapor transpired by forest vegetation. Ocean circulation patterns also stabilized as the extreme temperature contrasts that had driven intense circulation during the Ice Age gave way to more moderate gradients. This more stable oceanic circulation helped to distribute heat more evenly around the planet, contributing to the climatic conditions that supported diverse forest ecosystems across a wide range of latitudes. The marine ecosystems that had been severely disrupted by the extreme sea level changes and ocean chemistry modifications of the climate crisis also showed signs of recovery and renewed diversification. Shallow water marine communities, which had been repeatedly destroyed and re-established as sea levels fluctuated with the growth and melting of ice sheets, found more stable conditions that allowed for the development of complex ecological relationships. Coral reef communities began to re-establish themselves in tropical shallow waters, though these new reef ecosystems were built by different groups of organisms than their carboniferous predecessors. The marine organisms that constructed these new reefs had evolved more efficient mechanisms for extracting calcium carbonate from seawater and for coping with the chemical changes that had affected ocean composition during the climate crisis. The recovery of marine productivity had important implications for global carbon cycling, as healthy ocean ecosystems played crucial roles in processing atmospheric carbon dioxide through photosynthesis by marine phytoplankton and the formation of carbonate shells and skeletons by marine animals. These marine carbon cycling processes helped to balance terrestrial carbon fixation and contributed to the overall stability of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. The evolutionary radiations that occurred within these expanding and stabilizing ecosystems produced many of the major groups of organisms that would dominate terrestrial life in subsequent geological periods. Plant lineages that had originated during the climate crisis continued to diversify and give rise to new families and genera that would become important components of future ecosystems. The seed plants that had proven so successful during the period of environmental upheaval began to explore new evolutionary pathways that would eventually lead to the flowering plants that dominate modern terrestrial ecosystems. Early experiments in reproductive biology during this period laid the groundwork for the complex pollination systems and seed dispersal mechanisms that would characterize later plant communities. Vertebrate groups also continued to radiate and explore new ecological roles as forest ecosystems provided increasing opportunities for specialization and diversification. The reptilian lineages that had survived the climate crisis began to diverge into the major groups that would dominate terrestrial vertebrate communities for hundreds of millions of years. Early archosaurs began their evolutionary journey toward the forms that would eventually produce dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and birds. These early archosaurs experimented with different body plans and locomotory strategies, some becoming large terrestrial predators, while others remained smaller and more generalized in their ecological requirements. Synapsid reptiles continued their evolution toward the mammalian body plan, developing increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for metabolic regulation and sensory perception. Some synapside lineages became large herbivores that could efficiently process the diverse plant communities of mature forest ecosystems, while others evolved as specialized predators with enhanced sensory capabilities and hunting strategies. The invertebrate communities that inhabited these mature forest ecosystems also continued to diversify and explore new ecological niches. Insect groups that had originated during the climate crisis began to radiate rapidly, taking advantage of the increasing variety of plant resources and habitat types available in complex forest environments. Soil invertebrate communities became increasingly diverse and ecologically important as forest soils developed greater complexity and structural diversity. These soil animals played crucial roles in decomposition processes, nutrient cycling, and soil formation, creating the underground ecosystems that supported the productivity and stability of forest communities. The decomposer communities that inhabited forest soils reached new levels of diversity and functional specialization during this period of ecosystem maturation. Different groups of fungi and bacteria evolved to process different types of organic compounds, creating more efficient pathways for nutrient recycling and carbon cycling that could support higher levels of ecosystem productivity while maintaining stable environmental conditions. Mycorrhizal associations between plant roots and soil fungi became more extensive and sophisticated, creating underground networks that could facilitate resource sharing and communication between individual trees across entire forest communities. These fungal networks helped forest ecosystems respond more effectively to environmental stresses and maintain their stability even when faced with changing conditions. The pollination relationships between insects and plants continue to become more complex and specialized, even though true flowers had not yet evolved. Some plants developed increasingly sophisticated structures and chemical signals for attracting insect visitors, while insects evolved more specialized sensory systems and feeding behaviors for exploiting plant resources. These early plant-pollinator partnerships drove evolutionary innovation in both plant reproductive biology and insect sensory and feeding systems, laying the foundation for the remarkable coevolutionary relationships that would eventually produce the extraordinary diversity of flowering plants and their animal partners that characterizes modern terrestrial ecosystems. The seed dispersal mechanisms that evolved during this period also became more diverse and effective at promoting plant reproduction and population expansion. Wind-dispersed seeds became more sophisticated in their aerodynamic properties, while animal-dispersed seeds evolved more attractive and nutritious seed coats that could entice vertebrate dispersers to transport them to suitable germination sites. These improved dispersal mechanisms allowed forest communities to colonize new habitats more effectively and to recover more quickly from local disturbances such as fires, storms, or other events that created openings in the forest canopy. The ability to rapidly recolonize disturbed areas contributed to the resilience and long-term stability of forest ecosystems. The seasonal patterns that characterized many forest ecosystems became more pronounced and predictable as forest communities matured and regional climate patterns stabilized. Trees and other forest organisms evolved increasingly sophisticated responses to seasonal changes in environmental conditions, creating the synchronized ecological rhythms that would become characteristic features of temperate and boreal forest systems. Deciduous trees developed more efficient mechanisms for nutrient conservation during leaf senescence, allowing them to recover valuable elements from their leaves before shedding them each autumn. This improved nutrient retention made deciduous forests more efficient at maintaining soil fertility and reduced their dependence on external nutrient inputs from rock weathering and atmospheric deposition. Evergreen conifers also refined their strategies for surviving seasonal extremes, developing more effective mechanisms for protecting their photosynthetic tissues from freezing damage while maintaining some level of metabolic activity throughout winter periods. These adaptations allowed coniferous forests to expand into regions with more severe winter conditions than had been accessible to earlier forest types. The animal communities that inhabited these seasonally dynamic forests evolved increasingly complex behavioral and physiological adaptations for coping with predictable changes in resource availability and environmental conditions. Many species developed sophisticated strategies for energy storage and conservation that allowed them to survive periods when food was scarce or environmental conditions were challenging. Migration patterns also became more complex and predictable as animal communities learned to track seasonal resources across larger geographic areas. Some species evolved remarkable navigational abilities that allowed them to travel vast distances using celestial cues, magnetic fields, and other environmental signals, enabling them to exploit resources that were available in different locations at different times of the year. The fire ecology of forest ecosystems continued to evolve and become more sophisticated as both plants and animals developed increasingly specialized adaptations for surviving and exploiting the opportunities created by periodic fires. Many tree species evolved thick, insulating bark that could protect their vital cambium tissues from fire damage, while others developed the ability to resprout from underground root systems after their above-ground parts had been consumed by flames. Some plant species became increasingly dependent on fire for successful reproduction, evolving seeds that required specific fire-related cues for germination or reproductive structures that would only open and release seeds after exposure to the heat of forest fires. These fire-adapted species helped to maintain forest diversity by ensuring that periodic fires would create opportunities for their establishment and growth. Animal communities also developed more sophisticated strategies for surviving fires and exploiting the resources that became available in recently burned areas. Some species evolved behaviors that allowed them to detect approaching fires and flee to safe areas, while others learned to return quickly to burned areas to feed on the insects and other small animals that had been killed or displaced by the flames. The geographic distribution of forest ecosystems continued to expand and diversify as climate conditions stabilized, and different regions developed their own characteristic forest communities. The biogeographic patterns that emerged during this period would influence the distribution and evolution of terrestrial life for hundreds of millions of years, creating the foundation for the distinct regional floras and faunas that would characterize different parts of the world. Continental drift and mountain-building processes also began to influence the distribution and evolution of forest communities, as the supercontinent Pangaea continued to assemble and create new geographic barriers and connections between different regions. These geological processes would eventually lead to the isolation and independent evolution of forest communities on different continents, contributing to the biogeographic diversity that would characterize later periods of Earth's history. The legacy of the Great Climate Crisis that had been triggered by the first forests continued to influence Earth's environmental systems in ways that extended far beyond the immediate effects on forest ecosystems. The coal deposits that had formed during the period of massive carbon burial remained locked in underground formations, representing vast reservoirs of stored carbon that would eventually play important roles in both geological processes and human civilization. The atmospheric and oceanic changes that had been initiated by the forest-driven carbon sequestration had established new patterns of Earth system behavior that would continue to operate for hundreds of millions of years. The more efficient carbon cycling processes that had evolved during the recovery from the climate crisis would provide the foundation for all subsequent terrestrial carbon cycles. The soil systems and biogeochemical cycles that had developed during this period of environmental transformation would continue to operate in modified forms throughout the rest of Earth's history, providing the foundation for all future terrestrial ecosystems. The complex relationships between plants, soil organisms, and geological processes that had emerged during the recovery from the climate crisis would remain essential components of terrestrial ecosystem function. Perhaps most importantly, the climate crisis of the Carboniferous had demonstrated that biological processes could become geological forces, capable of reshaping entire planetary systems. This recognition would prove crucial for understanding not only the history of Earth's climate system, but also the potential for biological activities to influence global environmental conditions in ways that could affect the entire biosphere. The forests that had emerged from the Great Climate Upheaval represented a new form of biological organization that was better adapted to maintaining stable relationships with planetary environmental systems. These mature forest ecosystems had learned, through millions of years of environmental selection, to support high levels of biological diversity and productivity, while avoiding the kind of extreme environmental modifications that had triggered the original climate crisis. The story of how trees almost destroyed the climate had become a story of recovery, adaptation, and the remarkable capacity of life to learn from environmental challenges and create more stable and resilient forms of biological organization. The lessons embedded in this ancient environmental transformation would continue to resonate through the depths of geological time, shaping the character of terrestrial life and its relationship with planetary environmental systems for eons to come. As we reach the closing chapters of this ancient story, we find ourselves in a world that has been fundamentally transformed by the patient work of countless generations of trees. The Permian period draws toward its end, and with it, the most dramatic phase of the climate transformation that had begun so quietly with the first forests of the Devonian. The Earth that emerges from this long geological narrative bears little resemblance to the planet that had existed before trees learned to grow tall and sink their roots deep into solid rock. Where once bare continents stretched beneath skies heavy with carbon dioxide, now vast forests carpet the land, their canopies filtering sunlight through layers of green leaves that have become the planet's primary mechanism for processing atmospheric gases. The carbon cycle that operates in this transformed world has achieved a delicate balance that will endure for millions of years to come. The extreme sequestration rates that had once threatened to freeze the planet entirely have given way to more sustainable patterns of carbon exchange between the atmosphere the living world, and the geological systems that store carbon in rocks and sediments. Trees continue to remove carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis. But now that carbon returns to the atmosphere more reliably through the respiration of the sophisticated decomposer communities that have learned to break down even the most complex plant compounds. This newfound equilibrium represents one of the most significant achievements in the history of life on Earth. The forests have essentially taught the planet how to breathe in a new way, creating a respiratory system of continental scope that can regulate atmospheric composition within bounds that support complex life. The roots that penetrate deep into bedrock continue their patient work of chemical weathering. But now this process operates at rates that can be sustained indefinitely without driving atmospheric carbon dioxide to dangerously low levels. The soils that have formed beneath these mature forests represent another profound transformation of the terrestrial environment. These complex, layered substrates bear no resemblance to the thin, poorly developed surface materials that had characterized the pre-forest world. Instead, they function as vast living systems in their own right, harboring communities of microorganisms, fungi, and invertebrate animals that rival the complexity of any ecosystem that has ever existed on land. The uppermost layers of these soils teem with decomposer organisms that process the constant rain of dead leaves, fallen branches, and other organic matter that descends from the forest canopy above. Bacteria and fungi work in intricate partnerships to break down complex organic molecules, releasing nutrients in forms that plant roots can readily absorb, while sequestering carbon in stable soil compounds that can persist for centuries. Below these organic-rich surface layers, the mineral horizons of forest soils show the chemical signatures of millions of years of root activity and water movement. Iron compounds migrate downward through the soil profile, creating distinctive red and yellow bands that mark the boundaries between different chemical environments. Clay particles accumulate in deeper layers, forming dense horizons that can hold water and nutrients for plant use during dry periods. The ancient forests had completed their patient work of planetary transformation, leaving behind a world that would carry their legacy through hundreds of millions of years of geological time. The coal seams buried deep beneath the surface preserved the carbon that had once floated freely in the atmosphere, creating the vast underground reservoirs that would eventually fuel human civilization and, in a profound irony, contribute to a new kind of climate change, driven not by biological innovation, but by the rapid combustion of ancient sunlight stored in stone. The story of how trees almost destroyed the climate reminds us that our planet has always been a dynamic system, shaped by the unintended consequences of life itself reaching toward new possibilities. In the quiet depths of Earth's history, we find this remarkable chapter where the simple act of growing tall and sinking roots deep into rock transformed the very air that all future life would breathe, creating both crisis and renewal in the patient rhythm of deep time.